Are here. Bryan, thank you for your time. So Brian Kelly's obviously a very successful coach at LSU. He's been successful, did a lot of good things there. Is there any kind of sense that they feel not better, but Marcus Freeman might bring some breath of fresh air to take him to another level?
There's certainly that. I think it's not only that Marcus Freeman can take Notre Dame to another level, because I think everybody agreed, whether you're pro Brian Kelly or someone like me who maybe wasn't a huge fan of Brian Kelly and think sometimes they won in spite of Brian Kelly, that there's a breath of fresh air simply because of the type of person that Marcus Freeman is compared to Brian Kelly. You know, I just think it's after 12 years, I don't really care who you are. You kind of sometimes just are ready for a fresh voice, right? And I think that's where a lot of Notre Dame fans are, even a lot of Brian Kelly supporters. It was time for a change. And then, of course, Brian Kelly's recent comments, to be honest with you, about Notre Dame and taking shots at players and Jack Swarbrick and people like that, I think kind of cost him some of his supporters in South Bend that remain. So I think everybody's ready to move on and get a fresh start under Marcus Freeman.
All right, so, Brian, I guess the big question will be quarterback and how do they, with Tommy Rees, move this offense forward? Because I think people will probably, with Marcus Freeman bringing in Al Golden, they've got some experience. They've got, you know, he's still a defensive mind. It's the offense that people are wondering about.
Oh, absolutely, and rightfully so. I mean, Notre Dame's been really good on defense for several years. You know, going back to 2017 and really took off in 2018. It's the offense that's always been their undoing. And so that's going to remain the question. It was the question under Brian Kelly. And, you know, that's always the challenge for defensive coaches. I feel like defensive coaches are prone to making one of the big mistakes. We saw that. I'm a Denver Bronco fan. We saw that with Vic Fangio the last several years, which is in this modern era, still thinking you can win 17 to 14 football games. You've got to be able to score. And that's where we're going to find out. I think we saw glimpses of it late last season when, you know, Brian Kelly sort of backed off of the offense late last year, and Tommy Rees had more and more control. And, you know, Notre Dame's offense in the last 6 games averaged over 40 points a game. They lost the bowl game, but, you know, some of the optimism was that they passed for over 500 yards against an Oklahoma State defense that, you know, had been top 10 all year and had 300-yard receivers in the game against an Oklahoma State defense that only allowed one 100-yard receiver all season. So there's some optimism, but, you know, bowl games are bowl games, right? And I think we all know that bowl games only tell you so much. You got to see if you can consistently do it week after week after week. And let's be honest, guys, this schedule Notre Dame's about to face in 2022 is on a whole different level than the one they faced in 2021 when Notre Dame went 11-2 without beating a single ranked team all year.
Brian, in terms of who leaves the biggest shoes to fill player-wise, who would you say that is?
You know, that's a really good question. I would say Kevin Austin. And that doesn't mean that Kevin Austin is the best player they lost. You know, Kyle Hamilton's the best player they lost. That's not even a question. But, you know, they did get an All-American transfer in from Northwestern and Brandon Joseph. And Notre Dame had to play 6 games last year without Kyle Hamilton. So, you know, they've kind of got some experience with that. Kyron Williams is a great player, but they're loaded at backfield. I think, you know, Notre Dame last offseason had 5 receivers leave the team with multiple years of eligibility remaining. And the receiver depth chart right now, they're down to 4 healthy scholarship players for the spring. So, you know, if Kevin Austin would have chose to come back and he had eligibility left, I think that there'd be a lot less angst about the receiver position. So just from a need standpoint and what comes back, I think Kevin Austin's got whoever's going to step into that role has bigger shoes to fill than, you know, let's say Brandon Joseph replacing Kyle Hamilton, because he's not Kyle Hamilton, but he was still an All-American 2 years ago. He's a good football player. Right now there's a lot of uncertainty about who that guy is going to be that replaces Kevin Austin.
Brian, a listener of our show who also is the one that led me to getting in contact with you, he's from the 202 area code, and he brought this up about Marcus Freeman, if there's any questions about him, and obviously you mentioned the schedule, and my God, it is going to be interesting to see how they maneuver through that. But has Freeman gotten maybe more questions about him than perhaps Ryan Day had taking over for Urban Meyer or Lincoln Riley had when he took over for Bob Stoops?
I don't think so. You know, I think Marcus Freeman has established himself. I think the only difference is those guys had been at those programs for a little bit longer than Marcus Freeman. You know, so like Lincoln Riley had been the offensive coordinator at least 2 years, right, at Oklahoma. I believe Ryan Day had been at Ohio State for 2 years. I think that's the only difference. You know, they're similar in age. Marcus Freeman had established himself as a brilliant defensive mind. You know, we're talking about Kyle Hamilton being potentially a top 10 pick. Well, Sauce Gardner is also potentially going to be a top 10 pick, and he was recruited by and developed by primarily Marcus Freeman. You know, so He's proven himself as a great defensive mind. I think the questions about him as a head coach are the same ones that we had about Lincoln Riley going in. And it worked out, and it worked out for Ohio State. But we've seen other scenarios where a guy takes over and it doesn't work out. So I think there's always questions about a guy doing a job that he's never done before. But I think when you look at his attention to detail, his success as a coordinator, the way that players relate to him, and the biggest thing for me for a young coach is what kind of hires do you make? And for him to go out and bring in a veteran like Al Golden, I don't think that's getting enough attention. For a 36-year-old head coach to bring in a 51-year-old guy from the NFL who's been a head coach, I think says a lot about Marcus Freeman's in this, not saying, hey, it's not about my ego and all these type of things. You're bringing in a guy that's going to have very strong opinions to say, hey, you're going to do the job that I did before. I think speaks volumes of bringing in, obviously, Harry Heastan. He made it's been a great hire so far, getting Chancey Stuckey from Baylor. Obviously, that's worked out really well. He's a great fit at Notre Dame. So he put together a really good veteran staff. Not so much old staff, but veteran staff. And I think that shows me that he's a coach that understands, hey, I'm 36. I've never been head coach. I don't have all the answers. I need to make sure that between myself and my staff that we're going to be able to have the answers. And that's a good sign. Now we got to see if it's going to pay off when we get to the season.
The shot that Brian Kelly took at Notre Dame was kind of about the recruiting restrictions you have with the the academics and all that, and that LSU doesn't have those same things. And obviously he's putting out videos and doing things at LSU that shows that maybe he's rolling out the red carpet there. But what is the energy that Marcus Freeman has brought that's different than Brian Kelly shown up in recruiting so far in just a couple of months?
Well, he works. I mean, that's the biggest thing. Brian Kelly do all the photo ops he wants, but the problem is Brian Kelly would, and this is coming from players' mouths, he would meet them in January when they came back from the winter, and then he'd be gone until spring ball started. They would not have as many junior days and summer visits because Brian Kelly was out of town. He didn't work. That's the problem. He didn't work. And he can shoot all the videos of him grinding on players all he wants. The reality is recruiting is about building relationships. Relationships take time. Brian Kelly wasn't willing to invest the time. Marcus Freeman works. It's not a coincidence, fellas, that Notre Dame in the 1 year with Marcus Freeman and that last year's class, the 2022 class, was driven by the defense, was Notre Dame's best class in almost 10 years. It's not a surprise that Notre Dame currently sits with the #1 ranked class in the country since Marcus Freeman has arrived. The recruiting restriction stuff that Brian Kelly talked about was a lot of just the typical Brian Kelly spin. Brian Kelly making excuses for things he didn't do at Notre Dame. As if, they lost to Tulsa in 2010 because they don't have a chef on campus, that kind of thing. Like, no, it's because you made bad coaching decisions. And that's who Brian Kelly always was. I kind of like the joke that, Brian Kelly during his tenure went 113-0. Notre Dame, it's in restrictions, and its players went 0-39, meaning Brian Kelly was never the reason they ever lost the game. It was always somebody else. And I think that more than anything is what many Notre Dame fans, including myself, are just glad that it's gone.
Brian, we know with Notre Dame, the brand is huge, and there are things like academics, like the guys mentioned, that are a little bit different there. But the brand is massive. How do you feel like Notre Dame has, with what's at their disposal, navigated the NIL landscape we've all become accustomed to, and the transfer portal landscape we've all become accustomed to now as well?
Well, Notre Dame can't do a ton in the transfer portal, and that's one of the unique things that Notre Dame does have to make some moves on. So it's a little bit of a different situation there. They were able to get Brandon Joseph as an undergrad, but normally Notre Dame can really only make moves in the graduate transfer market because it's actually far harder to transfer to Notre Dame as an undergrad than it is to get in out of high school. Significantly harder. So they're still trying to navigate that. The NIL is still a work in progress, right? I mean, the one thing about Notre Dame, like it or not, they're gonna try to do things a certain way. So they're a little bit slower reacting to some of this big, NIL stuff. Notre Dame players are getting deals. I was told that one of their best players coming back this year just signed just got a $40,000 signing bonus for a marketing deal that he's going to do. Isaiah Foskey has his own clothing line now. So they're making money, but there hasn't been this big, infusion of cash that you're seeing from a lot of these other schools. Well, Brady Quinn just announced this week that him and Tom Mendoza, who is the person who they named the Mendoza School of Business at Notre Dame after, along with some other former players, have started a thing called Fund, Friends of University of Notre Dame. That's meant to help raise money for players to be involved in charity work, things like that they can make money off of. There's a couple other things. NBC Sports just launched an NIL deal that they're signed with Notre Dame. There's other few things in the pipeline, but It's taken a little bit longer because there's a lot more hoops you have to jump through, at Notre Dame than to do other things. But they're getting there. And look, this is a point Brady Quinn made to me in an interview I did with him. Notre Dame has I think the 8th biggest endowment in the country, including like the Ivies and things like that. And yet they're one of the smallest student bodies. So there's plenty of money out there to be had. You just got to try to find the right way to get it to players where it's done legally and within the spirit of what the NIL is supposed to be about.
By the way, Brian, Craig just showed me this. Darryl LaMonica, the former great Oakland Raiders quarterback, passed away. Is that correct?
Yeah, passed away at 80 years old. Yep. Former Notre Dame player as well.
One of the first Raider quarterbacks that just chunked it. And he had the people that chunk it too, and they were really good. He died today. Just saw that at the age yesterday at the age of 80. So there's a Notre Dame note as well. Brian, thank you, man. Good stuff. Look forward to it. Can't wait to talk to you again when we get close to the start of the season.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Bryan Driskell, Irish Breakdown, is part of SI Now.